Hello, my name is Leo and welcome to the reading of the Elder Scrolls. Today I'm going to be reading The Mystery of Princess Talara. Talara? Part 1 by Mara Linkus. The year was 30 or 405. The occasion was the millennial celebration of the founding of the Breton Kingdom of Camelon. Every grand boulevard and narrow alley was strung with gold and purple banners, some plain, some marked with the heraldic symbols of the royal family or the various principalities and dukedoms. I've heard that word before. Which were vassals of the king. Musicians played in the plazas, great and small, and on every street corner was a new exotic entertainer. Red Guard snake charmers, Khajiit acrobats, magicians of genuine power, and those whose flamboyant skill was equally impressive, if largely illusion. The sight that drew most of the male citizens of Camelon was the March of Beauty. 1,000 comely young women, brightly and provocatively dressed, danced their way down the long, wide main street of the city. From the temple of Sethet to the royal palace, the menfolk jostled one another and craned their necks, picking their favorites. It was no secret they were all prostitutes, and after the march and the flower festival that evening, they would be available for more intimate business. Jaina attracted much of the attention with her tail, curvaceous figure barely covered by strips of silk, and her curls of flaxen hair speckled with flower petals. In her late 20s, she wasn't the youngest of the prostitutes, but she certainly wasn't the most. But she certainly was. No, she was certainly one of the most desirable. Now that it was clear by her demeanor. Oh yeah, demeanor, that she was used to the less vicious, sure, glances. Though she was far from jaded at the sight of the city in splendor, compared to the squalid quarter of Daggerfall where she made her home. Camelon at the height of celebration seemed so unreal, and yet there was even what was even stranger was how at the same time familiar it all looked, though she had never been there before. The king's daughter, Lady Gilile, rode out of the palace gates and immediately cursed her misfortune. She had completely forgotten about the March of Beauty. The streets were snarled at a standstill. Snailed? And it would take hours to wait for the march to pass. And she had promised her old nurse, Ramk, a visit in her house south of the city. Julia thought for a moment, picturing in her mind the arrangement of streets in the city, and devised a shortcut to avoid the main street and the march. For a few minutes she felt very clever as she wound her way through the tight, curving side streets, but presently she came upon temporary structures, tents, and theatres set up for the celebration, and had to improvise a new path. In no time at all, she was lost in the city where she had lived all but 5 years of her life. Peering down an alley, she saw the main avenue crowded with the March of Beauty, hoping that it was the tail end, and desirous not to be lost again. Lady Julia guided her horse towards the festival. She did not see the snake charmer at the mouth of the alley, and when his pet hissed and spread its hood, her charge reared up in fear. The women in the parade gasped and surged back at the sight, but Lady Julia quickly calmed her stallion down. She looked abashed at the spectacle she had caught. "My apologies, ladies," she said with a mock military salute. It's all right, madam, said a blonde in silk. We'll be out of your way in a moment. Julia stared as the march passed her. Looking at that whore had been like looking in a mirror. The same age and height and hair and eyes and figure, almost exactly. The woman looked back at her, and it seemed as if she was thinking the same thing. And so Jaina was. The old witches, who sometimes came in to Daggerfall, had sometimes spoke of doppelgangers, spirits that assumed the guise of their victims and portended certain death. Yet the experience had not frightened her. It seemed only more strangely familiar. It seemed only one more strangely familiar aspect of the alien city. Before the march had danced its way into the palace gates, she had all but forgotten the encounter. The prostitutes crushed into the courtyard, as the king himself came to the balcony to greet them. At his side was his chief bodyguard, a battle mage by the look of him. Are they talking about Jagathan? Maybe. As the king himself, king or emperor? They said king, so they're talking about Dawnguard. True. As for the king himself, he was a handsome man of middle age, rather unremarkable, but Jaina was awed at the sight of him. A dream, perhaps. Yes, that was it. She could see him as she had dreamt of him, high above her, as he was now, bending now to kiss her. Not a one of lust, as she had experienced before. I don't think that R should be there. Not one of lust, as she had experienced before, but one of small fondness, a dutiful kiss. Dear ladies, you have filled the streets of the great capital of Camelon with your beauty, cried the king, forcing a silence on the giggling, murmuring assembly. He smiled proudly. His eyes met Jaina's. Jaina's? Yeah. And he stopped, shaken. For an eternity, they stayed locked together before His Highness recovered and continued his speech. Afterwards, while the women were all en route back to their tents to change into their costumes for the evening, one of the older prostitutes approached Jaina. Did you see how the king looked at you? If you're smart, you'll be the new royal mistress before this celebration ends. I've seen that hunger before, and that wasn't one of them, laughed Jaina. I'd wager he thought I was someone else, like that lady who tried to run us over with a horse. She's probably his kin, and he thought she had dressed up like a courtesan and joined the March of Beauty. Can you imagine the scandal? When they arrived at the tents, they were greeted by a stockily, well-dressed young man with a pale pate. Pate? A bald pate. What's a pate? I think that's like the top of your head. Okay. And a commanding presence of authority. He introduced himself as Lord Steral, ambassador to the Emperor. Hold on. I'm going to look at the word pate. Just to be on the safe side. Never be too careful. Okay. Sure. No, that is pate. That is not the same thing. Definitely not the same thing. Try bald pate. Sure. I will try bald pate. An American Wigeon, an allusion to its white-crowned head. Can I have a picture? I think it just means... Yeah, it's bald with, yeah. It's bald on the very top with like hair on the round sides. Kind of like a Japanese top knot without the top knot. Or those, what are they? Priests? I remember I think the Mila Jovovich Joan of Arc story had one of them. Where they shave the top of the head for some reason. I don't know. So, back to the story. Where were we? Alright, yes, Lord Steral, the ambassador to the Emperor himself, and their chief patron. It was Steral who had hired them on the Emperor's behalf as a gift to the king and kingdom of Camelon. The March of Beauty is but our precursor to the Flower Festival tonight, he said. Unlike the king, he did not have to yell to be heard. His voice was loud and precise in its natural modulations. I expect of you to perform well and justify the significant expense I have suffered bringing you all the way up here. Now hurry! You must be dressed and in your position on Cavalier Walk before the sun goes down. The ambassador needn't have worried. The women were all professionals, experts at getting dressed and undressed, with none of the time-consuming methods less promiscuous females required. His manservant, Norbooth, offered his assistance, but found he had little to do. Their costumes were simplicity itself, soft, narrow sheets with a hole for the heads. Wow, that's very easy access. Not even a belt was required. Well, of course, you gotta get in there. So the gowns were open at the sides, exposing the frame of their skin. So it's like a poncho, essentially? So it was long before the sun had set that the prostitutes turned dancers were Cavalier Walk. It was a great wide promontory facing the sea. And for the occasion of the Festival of Flowers, a large circle of unlit torches and covered blankets had been arranged. As early as they were, a crowd of spectators had already arrived. The women gathered in the center of the circle and waited until it was time. Gina watched the crowds as it grew, and was not surprised when she saw the lady from the march approaching, hand in hand with a very old, very short, white-haired woman. The old woman was distracted, pointing out islands out at sea. The blonde lady seemed nervous, unsure what to say. Gina was used to dealing with uneasy clients and spoke first. Good to see you again, madame. I am Gina of Daggerfall. I'm glad you bear me no ill. Wait, I'm glad you bear me no ill will because of the horse. The lady laughed, somewhat relieved. I am Lady Gilia Reyes, daughter of the king. I always thought that daughters of kings were called princesses, smiled Gina. In Camelon, only when they are heirs to the throne. I have a younger brother from my father's new wife, whom he favors, Gilly replied. She felt her head swim. It was madness, speaking to a common prostitute, talking of family politics so intimately. Relative to that subject, I must ask you something very particular. Have you ever heard of the Princess Talara? Talara? I want to say Talara. You touch my Talara. My ding-ding-dong. Stop it. Gina thought for a moment. The name seems somewhat familiar. Why would I have? I don't know. It was a name I thought you might recognize, sighed Lady Gilia. Have you been to Camelon before? If I did, it was when I was very young, said Gina, and suddenly she felt it was her turn to be trusting. Something about the Lady Gilia's friendly and forthcoming manner touched her. To be honest, I don't remember anything at all of my childhood before I was 9 or 10. Perhaps I was here with my parents, whoever they were, when I was a little girl. I guess they're like long lost, like conjoined twins or something. I tell you, I think perhaps I was. I don't recall ever being here before, but everything I've seen, the city, you, the king himself, all seem like I've been here before, long ago. Lady Gilia gasped and took a step back. She gripped the old woman, who had been looking out to sea and murmuring, by the hand. The elderly creature looked to Gilia, surprised, and then turned to Gina. Her ancient, half-blind eyes sparkled with recognition, and she made a sound like a grunt of surprise. Gina also jumped. If the king had seemed like something out of a half-forgotten dream, this woman was someone she knew. As clear as yet indistinct as a guardian spirit. I apologize, stammered Lady Gilia. This is my childhood nursemaid, Remke. It's her! The old woman cried, wild-eyed. She tried to run forward, arms outstretched, but Gilia held her back. Jaina felt strangely naked and pulled her robe against her body. "No, you're wrong," Lady Julia whispered. "No, you're wrong," Lady Julia whispered to Remnick, holding the woman tightly. "The Princess Talara is dead, you know that. I shouldn't have brought you here. I'll take you back home." She turned back to Jaina, her eyes welling with tears. "The entire royal family of Camelon was assassinated over 20 years ago. My father was Duke of Orleans, and the king's brother, and so he inherited the crown. I'm sorry to have bothered you. Good night." Jaina gazed after Lady Julia and the old nurse as they disappeared into the crowd. But she had little time to consider all she had heard. The sun was setting, and it was time for the flower festival. 12 young men emerged from the darkness wearing only loincloths and masks. Okay. And lit the torches. The moment the flares blazed, Jaina and all the rest of the dancers rushed to the baskets, pulling out blossoms and vines by the handful. At first the women danced with one another, sprinkling petals to the wind. The crowd then joined in as the music swelled. It was a mad and beautiful chaos. Jaina leapt and swooned like a wild forest nymph. Then, without warning, she felt rough hands grip her from behind and push her. She was falling before she understood it. The moment of the realization hit, she was closer to the bottom of a 100-foot-tall cliff than she was to the top. She flailed out her arms and grasped at the cliff wall. Her fingers raked against the stone, and her flesh tore, but she found a grip and held it. For a moment she stayed there, breathing hard. Then she began to scream. The music and the festival were too loud up above. No one could hear her. She could scarcely hear herself. Below her, the surf crashed. What are we dancing on the side of a cliff? What's going on here? Every bone in her body would snap if she fell. She closed her eyes. A vision came. A man was standing below her, a king of great wisdom, great compassion, looking up, smiling. A little girl, golden-haired, mischievous, her best friend and cousin, clung to the rock beside her. Who's talking? The sacred... Right, there's going to be a little kid's voice. I can't do a little kid's voice. That's it. I'm going to, pull up my testicles. The sacred falling is making your body go limp, and with that look, you won't get hurt, the girl said. She nodded, remembering who she was. 8 years of darkness lifted. She released her grip and let herself fall like a leaf into the water below. Yeah, that was a long one. Yeah, there's 5 chapters of this book, by the way. That was The Mystery of Princess Talara, Part 1, by Morrowind. So obviously, what's her name? Forgot the name. Jaina is cousin to Lady Julia, and the rightful heir, I guess, because she's the princess. Alright. Well, we will continue this in the next part, but for now, my name is Leo, and I will see you next time.